Welcome back to another episode of the Four Archetypes. I think we've been trimmed down to 3 today. So, as we return to Archetypal Symbols and Fairy Tales by Mary Louise von Franz, we discover where these stories are headed, right? So, let's talk a little bit about that. Before we get into it, let me just say hi to everybody. Dr. Eric, how are you doing today?
Doing well, sir. Ready to explore the cosmic world.
Oh, there we go. Dr. Eric is up for it. Whitman, how are you doing today?
Doing well. Waking up.
Excellent.
Yeah. Looking
Excellent.
forward to it.
Okay, so let's get into it. So Mary Louise von Franz is quite prolific. She had left a stack or stacks of manuscripts, papers, essays that are being published, and there are 28 volumes of these papers that are coming out. So she's pretty prolific, and we're in volume 4.
And you were saying before,
volume 3.
you were saying before,
Quest.
you were saying before that there was a fire. So this is only the 28 volumes that will be produced from her papers.
Yeah.
This is only some fraction of what she actually.
Yeah. She burnt her personal notes, diaries, dreams, personal correspondence with people. She saw what happened to Carl Jung and how those papers ended up becoming books and people reading them, and kind of while she was alive. I mean, this is her contemporary, right? She was a kid when she started with Jung, but she watched him throughout his life, and she was there present for him. And so after he dies, all these, basically his own private thoughts, his musings, the Red Book, for example, now the Black Books, which are all personal material of his musing, of his mind, is basically being published and being scrutinized. So she did not want that to happen to her, Whitman.
Okay, so she burned. This wasn't an accidental fire. This was
no. She didn't like. She used her fireplace. She sat there and she went through her personal journals, and she had basically a long running fire that she kept like adding to. I mean, she lives in Switzerland, so they have fireplaces, and she lives in a remote area. So, or a village. It's not remote these days, but in a village where she has a house and she has a large fireplace. So she burnt those papers, and she didn't want anybody to be digging through her garbage, her stuff, her personal stuff. So
yeah,
very interesting. I thought we reflect on it because I don't know if everybody knows where these stories are coming from. So von Franz basically went through humanity's fairy tales, and she started to talk about the fairy tale as part of our collective psychological development. So it's not just a fairy tale, it's part of how our psyche works. It's the mechanisms of our psyche, you know. So if you're medical school and you start dissecting the cadaver, you start to understand what makes up the insides of the human body. In psychology, to understand what makes up the human mind and how it operates, is to understand that the psyche is complex. at the same time, there's an inherent pattern to our psychological structures. And those patterns are in the fairy tales.
And dreams.
Correct. So I think for von Franz, dreams and fairy tales are almost synonymous sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Our personal dreams, our connection to the fairy tale. I mean, I think we were talking about it earlier. Conspiracy theories, fairy tales. We just don't call them fairy tales, right? A fairy tale doesn't have negative connotation. It's just a fairy tale. Conspiracy theory has a negative connotation. Somebody's up to something. Somebody wants something. Somebody's trying to pass something. So, but in time, the conspiracy theory will become a fairy tale. Because so much time has basically washed over the shore.
Right.
So our basic psychology hasn't changed. Just because we don't tell so many fairy tales anymore doesn't mean we don't create more fairy tales. We're still creating fairy tales. Okay. So, Dr. Eric, why don't you take us away? We're gonna go through the Fitcher's birth today.
Okay.
And Dr. Eric will read the first part, and Whitman will read the second part. So,
okay.
Without further ado.
There was once a sorcerer who used to take the form of a poor man and went to houses and begged and caught pretty girls. No one knew whither he carried them, for they were never seen again. One day he appeared before the door of a man who had 3 pretty daughters. He looked like a poor, weak beggar and carried a basket on his back, as if he meant to collect charitable gifts in it. He begged for a little food, and when the eldest daughter came out and was just reaching a piece of bread out to him, he did but touch her, and she was forced to jump into his basket. Thereupon he hurried away with long strides and carried her away into a dark forest to his house that stood in the very midst. Everything in the house was magnificent. He gave her whatsoever she could possibly desire and said, "My darling, thou wilt certainly be happy with me, for thou hast everything thy heart can wish for." This lasted a few days, and then he said, "I must journey forth and leave thee alone for a short time. Here are the keys of the house. Thou mayest go everywhere and look at everything except into one room, which this little key here opens, and there I forbid thee to go on pain of death." He likewise gave her an egg and said, "Preserve the egg carefully for me, and carry it continually about with thee, for a great misfortune would arise from the loss of it." She took the keys and the egg and promised to obey him in everything. When he was gone, she went all around the house from the bottom to the top and examined everything. The rooms shone with silver and gold, and she thought she had never seen such great splendor. At length she came to the forbidden door. She wished to pass it by, but curiosity let her have no rest. She examined the key. It looked just like any other, and she put it in the keyhole and turned it a little, and the door sprang open. But what did she see when she went in? A great bloody basin stood in the middle of the room, and therein lay human beings, dead and hewn to pieces, and hard by was a block of wood, and a gleaming axe lay upon it. She was so terribly alarmed that the egg which she held in her hand fell into the basin. She got it out and washed the blood off, but in vain. The blood appeared again in a moment. She washed and scrubbed, but she could not get it out. It was not long before the man came back from his journey, and the first thing he asked her for were the key and the eggs. She gave them to him, but she trembled as she did so, and he saw at once by the red spots that she had been in the bloody chamber. "Since thou hast gone into the room against my will," said he, "thou shalt go back into it against thine own. Thy life is ended." He threw her down, dragged her thither by her hair, cut her head off on the block, and hewed her into pieces so that her blood ran on the ground. Then he threw her into the basin with the rest. Now I'll fetch myself the second girl. And the wizard, and again he went to the house as a poor man and begged. The second daughter brought him a piece of bread. He caught her like the first by simply touching her and carried her away. She did not fare better than her sister. She allowed herself to be led away by her curiosity, opened the door of the bloody chamber, looked in, and had to atone for it with her life on the wizard's return. Then he went and brought the third sister, but she was more clever and crafty than her elder sisters. When he had given her the keys and the egg and had left her, she first put the egg away with great care, and then she examined the house, and at last went into the forbidden room. Alas, what did she behold? Both her sisters lay there in the basin, cruelly murdered and cut into pieces. But she began to gather their limbs together and put them in order, head, body, arms, and legs. And when nothing further was wanting, the limbs began to move and unite themselves together, and both the maidens opened their eyes and were once more alive. Then they rejoiced and kissed and embraced each other.
Okay. On his arrival, the man at once demanded the keys and the egg, and as he could perceive no trace of any blood on it, he said, "Thou hast stood the test, thou shalt be my bride." He now had no longer any power over her, and was forced to do whatsoever she desired. "Oh, very well," said she. "Thou shalt first take a basket full of gold to my father and mother, and carry it thyself on thy back. In the meantime, I will prepare for the wedding." Then she ran to her sisters, whom she had hidden a little chamber, had hidden in a little chamber, and said, "The moment has come when I can save you. The wretch shall himself carry you home again. But as soon as you are at home, send help to me." She put both of them in a basket and covered them quite over with gold, so that nothing of them was to be seen. Then she called in the wizard and said to him, "Now carry the basket away, but I shall look through my little window and watch to see if thou stoppest on the way to stand or to rest." The sorcerer raised the basket on his back and went away with it, but it weighed him down so heavily that the perspiration streamed from his face. Then he sat down and wanted to rest a while, but immediately one of the girls in the basket cried, "I am looking through my little window, and I see that thou art resting. Wilt thou go on at once?" He thought his bride was calling that to him, and got up on his legs again. Once more he was going to sit down, but instantly she cried, "I am looking through my little window, and I see that thou art resting. Wilt thou go on directly?" And whenever he stood still, she cried this. And then he was forced to go onwards, until at last, groaning and out of breath, he took the basket with the gold and the two maidens into their parents' house. At home, however, the bride prepared the marriage feast and sent invitations to the friends of the wizard. Then she took a skull with grinning teeth, put some ornaments on it and a wreath of flowers, carried it upstairs to the garret window, and let it look out from thence. When all was ready, she got into a barrel of honey, and then cut the feather bed open and rolled herself in it, until she looked like a wondrous bird, and no one could recognize her. Then she went out of the house, and on her way she met some of the wedding guests, who asked, "O Fitcher's bird, how comest thou here?" "Come from Fitcher's house quite near." "And what may the young bride be doing?" "From cellar to garret she's swept all clean, and now from the window she's peeping, I ween." At last she met the bridge groom, who was coming slowly back. He, like the others, asked, "O Fitcher's bird, how comest thou here?" I come from Fitcher's house quite near. And what may the young bride be doing? From cellar to garret she's swept all clean, and now from the window she's peeping, I ween. The bridge room looked up, saw the decked-out skull, though it was his bride, and nodded to her, greeting her kindly. But when he and his guests had all gone into the house, the brothers and kinsmen of the bride, who had been sent to rescue her, arrived. They locked all the doors of the house so that no one might escape, set fire to it, and the wizard and all his crew had to burn.
Yay.
That's it.
Okay, so there's several different things going on in this story. So let's start with the three daughters. The story starts about three daughters that the wizard kidnaps. By disguising himself as a beggar, he comes to ask for help, for food. And through their compassion, through their energy of compassion, the first daughter is touched on the hand, she disappears into the basket. So it's a magical story, right? She wakes up in this grand house that's all decked out in the finest of the fine at the time. So now she's trying to transform wealth into her happiness, right? So she's developing a consciousness, she's growing, expanding her understanding of the way the world. So the first thing is to have wealth, right? To kind of like, oh, this wealth is going to make me happy. First stage of learning. Okay, fellas, what did you guys think of the story?
Well,
what hit you, maybe? What stuck out?
I think the first thing that hit me, several things did, but right off the bat, the thing that hit me is as in the beginning, this said this is the German counterpart to, to the story we did last time. And once again, we see in the beginning that when we are in early development, when we haven't really integrated our shadow, our dark side, when we're still at an immature level, which we battle with till the day we die, of course. But in the beginning, it's very easy to be lured by external things. It's very easy to be taken in by things that as we get older and more integrated and more mature, we wind up seeing that they don't mean as much. They're not as important.
So innocence has to die for us to be able to grow, right? Innocence is part of our developmental stage when we're younger. But as we grow older, so the first thing that has to die with this young woman is that she's no longer innocent. When he introduces, so he kidnapped her. So when he introduces her to the wealth, she's like, well, maybe I'll be happy.
Yeah.
Maybe this will make me happy. So that's the first, like, innocence is gone. Now, consciousness appears. So innocence is like the opposite of consciousness. Innocence is like everything is okay. It's not exactly what I see. It's everything's okay. Everything is going to work out. It's magical. Innocence is magical.
Yeah, it is.
So this is how they're all captured. They're still in their magical thinking phase. Oh, look, the old man, he's a beggar. Oh, here, let me give you some of my energy. Let me give you some of my power. Let me give you something of my youth. So suddenly he takes that, and this is how he grows, right? Von Franz calls him a demonic sorcerer, or as Eric, as you said, the shadow, the dark side. Oh, so this is what they're facing now. They're coming out of their shell. They're coming into, this is the individuation process, right? And this, in this story, it's 3 stages, 3 phases. Right.
And if this were a dream, this could be, I guess, the person having the dream could be, any one of these characters, right?
Well, all of the characters.
But if
also.
they were, right.
So you could be one of the characters or all the characters. It's your dream.
Yeah. It's your dream. The beggar is a shadow, though.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it also
an anima.
Animus.
Okay, animus, the male. Yeah.
So he represents the masculine. But because it's so disassociated with, so disconnected, it is all consuming, all tormenting, all evil. The further away it is from us, the more destructive it is. The closer it is to us, the more we're able to integrate it. It becomes a protective, a force to determine our existence. Because what happens is, at the end of the story, is that she is able to overcome all of them, and she burns them in the house. And the fire is the transformational aspect, right? It's destruction and recreation. When we burn something, we're destroying something, but we're also creating something completely new from the fire.
I also like the fact that even though it certainly is a big aid for many people in development, age is not the single criteria for it. Because here's the youngest daughter, and she's the one, the first 2 he makes them carry this egg around and treat it like, like it's the most valuable thing on the planet. An egg representing the first stage of development. And
also the self, the egg representing the self. So they're undifferentiated, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so the 3rd daughter, she says, I ain't carrying that thing around. I'm putting it over here.
Yeah.
She had moved past that stage of development.
Yeah. So she's differentiated. She differentiated herself from the egg. I don't need to carry it. Why am I carrying it? That's
and
stupid.
She's the youngest.
Well, so symbolically in the story, the youngest is the most conscious. The youngest is aware of the environment more than the oldest. The oldest is naive. Right?
No, the youngest is naive, though.
Well, and no, I think the youngest is not naive. She's innocent, but she's not naive. The oldest is naive, because as you age with your innocence, you become naive. You're no longer called innocent when you're older. You're called naive. So she is innocent, but does not mean that she didn't learn from watching the other 2 go into this basket. She had been, so it's 3 phases of development. The first phase was when the oldest daughter, so this is kind of the magic trick that Von Franz uses. She uses the oldest as the symbol of in fairy tales, they use the oldest as the symbol of the first to fall.
I thought Von Franz said in one of her essays that we you sent a link to, was that the youngest, typically there are like multiple siblings, like in
Yeah.
a lot of these stories, just like
Correct.
Bluebeard, right? There's several sisters, and the youngest is the first to fall. Kind of.
So in fairy tales, what we've noticed from reading them, especially through von Franz, is that it's the most unlikely of the grouping that prevails. So if it's the person who's considered the dumbest, they're the ones who are the wisest. If the most agile and the fiercest, they fall first. So that's been like a consistent theme. And that basically what it's saying is in psychology, in Jungian psychology, the more inflated you are psychologically, the more likely you will fall first. So this is about psychological inflation. So when she says the oldest, that means I think I know everything.
Yeah.
Be modest.
So psychological inflation for Jung was the downfall of all of us.
Yeah, that was a good way of saying it, Lahab.
So that's where the symbols in the stories sometimes throw us off. The Jungians have a particular way of interpretation. Now, others may interpret similarly, but not to this extent, because what the Jungians are talking about, what von Franz is talking about, is the psychology of an individual. So, like you said, Whit, like a dream of one person, right? When most of these fairy tales are dreams, hallucinations, delusions, right? There are worse fears coming to take us apart, So everything that we've inherited, right? So for Jung, the collective unconscious is where the source of everything that we've inherited, like we've inherited our DNA. And that we could trace our DNA back all the way to Africa. Jung theorized that there's a collective unconscious that picks up the psychological components like DNA and has a system of remembering all those psychological components. Therefore, those stories are part of how these psychological components were created. Right? So like their DNA strands. So if you start staring at the story, you could see the DNA strands of the story. At the egg, 3 sisters, the oldest, middle, and youngest. The demonic, the wizard, the sorcerer, the father who disappears, by the way. So the father disappears once the sisters have been captured. No longer in the story. Disappears from the story. And when the youngest realizes what she needs, she suddenly has 2 brothers who come to her rescue. So these are aspects of her. These are aspects of her animus that she is now recalling. Now she is integrating that aspect of her, the aspect of the animus. She's integrating that part of herself. And the final act of the integration is to burn the house with them in it. Right? But what she does is she holds a mirror up to him in public. And that's the skull. To the demon animus. She elevates the skull because that's his mirror. He can't see himself. He's dead.
The decked out skull.
The decked out skull.
Which got to figure out exactly what we're working with here. But most likely, yeah.
Is what she is holding up for him to see himself. In Snow White, is it Snow White?
A decorated
Snow
skull,
White?
most likely a decorated skull. Or if we go further back in time, we're looking at.
So in Snow White, you have the queen.
Hold on.
And she asks herself over the evil queen, asks herself in the mirror over and over again, who's the prettiest of them all? Right? So it says Snow White. Okay. So in the Fitcher's bird, the mirror is the decked out skull. She says in the book, she says it's almost like a cultish ritual. Like she understands his language and she understands how to vanquish him.
Right.
By making him see himself.
It could also be covered. You know, as far as imagery goes, I'm just, you know.
Well, it doesn't really matter at that point. She is using a symbol. Mm-hmm. And that's usually what we use. Like in Christianity, the cross is a symbol. Right?
Yeah.
They're different symbols. We use different symbols to do different things, to say different things, to express different ideas, feelings, thoughts, allegiances.
Dr. Lahab, hey, Whitman, Dr. Lahab always tells me that my symbol is a question mark.
That's the Riddler's. You cannot steal that. That's the Riddler's. That's not you.
He uses that for
you're more like the Joker. Yeah,
he uses that to emphasize a riddle. You emphasize it with me to emphasize who the heck is guy? What is this guy? I don't know. Question mark. So, anyway, another theme that I keep seeing in these stories is, and we Dr. Lisa talked about this last week or the week before, and which is true. I mean, in order for people to change and develop, they have to want to. They have to have a desire. They have to be motivated to. They don't have to have all the answers, but there has to be something in their mind and heart and spirit that wants to be more than what they are.
Correct.
But having said that, once again, what do we see? We see the two sisters that didn't develop getting help from another person, their third sister.
Yeah.
She helped piece them together and put them back together, and it restored them on their journey again. And it just never fails that we need other people in our lives. We're social creatures, and we cannot live completely alone, isolated from other people if we want to develop.
Correct.
Right.
I think with the point that you started to make about the about how they kind of didn't develop anymore. The question is not that they didn't develop anymore, is that they traded development for the treasure. The treasure is development, right? That's usually kind of the hidden egg in all of these mysteries. Development, right? So how do we develop? What is development? How do we become conscious? How do we become conscious of things that are dangerous to us? They traded that in for the treasure. The treasure is what? The treasure is this decked out, wealthy looking place with all these things, and say, oh, that's all I need.
Well, isn't it that? Yeah, but
that's
isn't
the
it
beginning point?
Yeah, but isn't it that's the fast people want to, sidestep or bypass the the creativity, the introspection. They want to get straight to the success, the riches, the wealth immediately. And the stories remind us that the caution, the judgment, the struggle, challenge, introspection ultimately is what wins. That's what works. And I think that's what von Franz in Individuation, that's what she discusses, is that the self, tying her work in to this fairy tale, is that the self is more realized when it is able to kind of link up with the ego, and maybe even through dreams or noticing certain patterns, over time, the self is more realized when the ego is able to identify, parts, or rather maybe the self is more realized when
No, you had it right.
There's this
Had it right,
process of, right?
You had it right.
Yeah,
The
of
ego is
struggle,
more
of
realized when
challenge.
it's connected to the self. When
Right.
it starts to overcome what its main function is. The main function of the ego is to help you get through a period of time in your life that hopefully you will not need it anymore. So to jump in from the beginning to give up your ego because there's all the wealth, I don't need to worry about anything, I'm done. As soon as you give that up, you're overwhelmed by the undifferentiated state. And the undifferentiated state, as you're talking about, is within the egg, is holding on to the egg.
Well, that's interesting, because I would have thought that the ego is the entity, the part of the person that is going straight to the wealth, whereas the self is not being realized. The self is in the background.
So the ego in Jungian psychology, the way Jung sees the ego, it's a tiny reflection of the self, a minuscule reflection, but it's needed for consciousness. The self itself lives in the unconscious.
Right.
So the ego is like this small light that is required for the ego to basically show this person, help this person differentiate themselves. And then through that process of differentiation, what ultimately happens is individuation.
Yeah, it's kind of like the scout being sent out, to see what's going on, and then
coming back and
and then it brings that
group.
It brings that information back. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful example. I like that. That's
Yeah.
a great example.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that, Dr. Eric. So the scout is sent out.
Yes. To do
give an example. Give an example of some scout.
Well, it could be an army scout, for example.
Perfect. Okay.
You're in a particular part of of territory and you don't know what's out there. You send out a scout, or sometime nowadays it's usually 2 to 3 people that are sent out as scouts to reconnoiter, to find out, to survey, and they bring that information back, and then that information is used by the rest of the quote unquote self, the headquarters of the army, to decide what's the best plan of action.
Yeah. The scout doesn't decide anything. The scout is only there to observe.
Now, unfortunately, if you have a self that is not actuated or individuated, sometimes they send those scouts out as bait to get killed and shot so that they can know where the enemy is. It's not always done in the best of intentions, but I'm talking about if it's done correctly.
That's when the self is undifferentiated. That's when
Yes.
you're holding on to the egg. The egg is more important than your life. That's when the
Yes.
self, that's the beginning of the story. The beginning
I
of
also,
the story is to send out the scouts, and the scouts get shot.
yeah.
She
And that's
takes
what
the
happened
egg,
to the
she
first
goes into the
sisters.
cellar, she drops it in
Yeah.
the blood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also like a thing that you added to something that I brought up before, which helped me to now see that I can word it differently. And that is, you mentioned that with the first two sisters, their development didn't necessarily stop. And I like that because it helps me to see when I said their development stopped, what I should have said and would say in the future is that their development towards actualization or individuation, that's what came to a halt. But we still develop when the shadow has taken us over, we still develop. We just develop in very dysfunctional ways.
Yes.
And so the development continues on. It was just the positive growth, the positive individuation that was halted. But growth
so
still occurred.
3 phases, right? 3 phases of development, and the individuation process continues, right? So the individuation process is about being able to ingest, whether it's bitter, whether it's sweet, whether it's sour, whether it's salty. It's the ability to be able to take in all the elements. That's the individuation process, is to hold the four different aspects, the 4 archetypes in balance. That's the individuation process.
And the 4 archetypes being, just for...
Well, the 4 archetypes being the magician, king, queen, lover, warrior, Amazonian. It's all those pieces.
Okay.
Being able to center yourself, the self is the center of the archetypes. So think of it that way. So there are different gods, and
so we're not technically limited to 4 archetypes, but this is the...
Yeah, for Jung, there were a primary 4 functioning archetypes that kind of created what is called known society.
Okay.
There are archetypal patterns that lead in those directions. Over time, those archetypal directions have created subsystems and different systems. And that's why we have so many archetypes, because all those subsystems have grown their own pattern.
Mm-hmm.
But everyone has some, or everybody has some of one or more of the main 4, though.
Right.
Right.
So I just wanted to, I just wanted to pause and point that out for the listeners.
No. That's a good point. The 4
Make sure
are
we're all
inherited.
on the same page.
They're like DNA strands, right? They're the letters on the DNA. The 4 are inherited. What the 4 create is something different in each individual.
Yeah. No, that's fine. Let's go back. Sorry, there's a little bit of a tangent.
Yeah, well, we take tangents on this.
It's a connected tangent.
Tangents. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
We have been questioned at times.
How could we?
Being tangential.
But it's a connected tangent. It traces back. It traces back to the core.
Yeah.
Well, this is an interesting conversation. I think the egg is the part that we should look at. The egg is the symbol of the self. So the first 2 stages of development, the symbol of the self is undifferentiated. Therefore, they hold on to the egg. The 3rd phase of development in this story, she is able to separate herself from the egg. Therefore, she, as Dr. Eric put it, like a scout, was able to go see where the enemy was, what they were hiding, and come back to create a plan.
Yeah. I think it's it's important to question. It's very important to question. I think introspection is good, but don't stop walking.
Okay. Yeah.
Paralysis of analysis.
You feel me?
It's what I've
You
heard
feel me?
somebody call.
Yeah.
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 Don't engage in paralysis of analysis.
Because if we don't question, if we're not introspective, we miss things about ourselves. We're disconnected in a way, right?
Absolutely.
For me, who's not the academic here and this psychology and so forth, for the layman,
Yeah.
we're disconnected. We have, it's good to
questioning
be,
helps us become more conscious of what we are looking at. The
Right.
questioning always clarifies our view. The more we question, the more we see from different aspects. It's the questioning
Exactly.
that, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Just keep going.
Keep asking the questions.
Keep asking questions and keep moving.
Keep moving. Okay, with that,
I like the way it ended too, with her becoming a bird, the Fitcher's bird. It said that the wedding guests didn't even recognize who she was. She just she allowed the spirit, the real spirit of who she was, to let her fly, and in the end, it allowed her to overcome her shadow.
freedom.
She became free.
Yeah, freedom.
It's really a great ending to the story.
With that, this is the Four Archetypes. And as we always leave you with, I am not afraid.
I am not afraid.
I am not afraid.
We are the Four Archetypes, and we are not afraid. And we will see you next week, everybody. Thanks for being with us.